After its European stint, Formula One begins the flyaway portion of the season this weekend, kicking off with the 2023 Singapore Grand Prix. It's the inaugural, the quintessential night race of the modern calendar, as F1 returns to street circuit racing for the first time since May's Monaco Grand Prix. I'm Alex Kalinauckas, chatting today with Matt Q, who's about to head off on what I understand is a multi-leg journey to Singapore tomorrow. So, Matt, the track you're going to, we've known it since 2008. It's been on the calendar ever since, other than its sort of COVID unfortunate hiatus. It's going to look a bit different this year, though, right?
As you say, when I eventually get there, I'll report back on what it looks like. Yeah, it's like not including transfers to airports and train journeys and all that. It's 25 hours door to door. So I can only apologise to Singapore passport control where my passport inevitably fails and I'm tetchy and sweaty and horrible. But when we get there, Alex, a bit of a different look to the final sector. So Singapore post-COVID, bit of investment going on in the entertainment sort of industry and a complex around that final sector. I think they're building a new stage as part of like a project that's going on until 2026. But what that means for F1 for this year, and I believe it's this year only, subject to I suppose any construction delays, is we're losing some of those fiddly. I'd say typical Singapore, but not universally popular sort of 90-degree corners in exchange for a longer straight. So I think you lose about 150 meters from the length of the lap, but about 10 seconds from last year's 10 seconds from the 2019 Leclerc pole time, but it was about 20 seconds compared to last year because that was wet, dry session. That track took ages to dry then, so that's why the lap times never really came along, and it should be good. I think bit more of a overtaking zone, or certainly potential for it. Would have been a slipstream down the back straight. So I am cautiously optimistic about the changes. But I know something you've been paying attention to is not just sort of what the changes will be, but how they'll manifest themselves and if they will suit any team in particular, or whether Red Bull will win everything this season, as we're sort of getting perilously close to. So Alex, what do you make of the form guide?
So just before we do that, it would be remiss of me not to mention that when you get to the front of that passport control queue, don't do what one of our media colleagues did last year and leave his laptop there, because that caused all sorts of shouting, arm-waving shenanigans of people trying to get back to recover it, which he successfully did. And then once you are out of the airport, my experience there last year is that the sort of Singapore equivalent of Uber is brilliant, and the taxi system operation at the airport, fantastic. So there you go. I know you'll be adapting to the quite mad arrangement where you stay on European time, but my experience of that last year was you seem to gain time in this weird way because you're going to bed so late and getting up so early. It just makes the working day, in a weird way, much easier to navigate, even though you will struggle to get food though, so try not to starve to death. But future Mac Q problems anyway. Which teams might be sort of favoured or harmed by these track changes? Well, it was really interesting in Monza, particularly in the press conference after the race. Max Verstappen and Sergio Perez both absolutely adamant that this track heading to Singapore represents a real threat to Red Bull. They're adamant they're just not going to be as strong as they have been in other races, which is really weird because obviously Verstappen was a pretty dominant Monaco winner. If had it not been for the rain at the end, it would have been a pretty straightforward romp to victory there from pole position. So it's another street circuit. It's more high downforce again. They'll be on their max downforce packages, but Red Bull in particular seems worried. Now, the reason why I'm pretty sure it is worried about that is all down to do with the track changes, because Singapore famously throughout its time on the calendar, it's just a tyre torturer, particularly in qualifying. I think come the race, they're all operating to their delta times. They're just managing the stints, getting through what is the phenomenally punishing conditions as best they can. But come qualifying, it's a whole different challenge because they are, of course, pushing as hard as they can, but keeping the tyres alive for those final few turns come the end of the lap is notoriously difficult. And essentially, I think what Red Bull fears is that, as has been the case on several other occasions this season, where there have been 90-degree corners, some straights. Let's think Baku. Ferrari has beaten them to pole position. Now, it's not like Monza and Baku where there are super long straights, and that plays to the changes Ferrari have made for this air package for 2023 and making it sort of, slightly more aerodynamically efficient in a straight line. But what Red Bull fears is that because Ferrari famously chews through its tyres, the absence of corners or the absence of corner for this year compared to last year means that Ferrari theoretically should have an easier time come sector 3. So therefore, if you put the Ferraris, both of them potentially starting ahead of both Red Bull cars, even just one of them, the challenge of overtaking at Singapore is immense. And I think that was summed up perfectly in the race last year, where Max Verstappen made a real mess of his coming back after Red Bull had not put enough fuel in his car come qualifying. So that's what Red Bull fears, that it won't be like Monza. If it starts behind, it will just stay behind. But of course, the counterbalance to that is what we know about this Red Bull car, is that it simply is the best of the season. Its strengths are in the race and not qualifying, but it nevertheless has got more poles than anybody else. So take that with a pinch of salt. But that does explain why Red Bull are sort of fearing what could happen at Singapore. But other teams sort of thinking that they might struggle at Singapore, having been good at places like Monza, for example, Williams. Matt, what are your thoughts on them, and particularly with Alex Albon? Is this another chance for him to produce a stunning points drive, or is it one that Williams are going to be rather fearing?
The thing with Albon and Williams is it now feels almost like the boy who cried wolf, doesn't it? Where, we're not going to be very good this weekend, 7th. But this weekend we'll really struggle, 8th. It's like points. But on paper, this, after Monza, this obviously looks like a track that will favour them less. The changes should help in theory, because you take away some of those higher downforce dependent corners, and that should, fall into the hands of Williams, who, it's not the best aero package, and ultimately more time spent in a straight line suits their efficiency, again linked to them not having the most downforce. But as you say, their weakness is tyres, so with the conditions being so hot, they will chew through those. So you would expect that to sort of hamper Alex Albon. Whether he can sort of counteract that by keeping his car quick over one lap and then holding everyone up on those longer straights with its straight line efficiency, sort of do another defensive drive like how he was frustrating Norris in Monza. Maybe he could pull something similar off that. The other side of the garage, it's been a season of hard knocks for Sargeant, and Singapore is not going to be very easy for him to adapt to either. So whether that will blunt sort of Williams' chances any further. However, I do think that they've got worse races to come after this. So if they can, by some measure, offset that exaggerated tyre deg and the extreme temperatures and the humidity, I think it will be not as bad as when they get to Brazil, and the air is so thin, and it's such a and same with Mexico City, where it's the air so thin, it's such a downforce dependent. They're going to be doing nothing basically. They're not going to be able to hold on to the air to push the car into the track surface. So Singapore might be not as bad as it does get for Williams. But I suppose if we're talking about Williams and Red Bull, saying they'll win by 10 seconds rather than 30 seconds, it sort of says a lot about this season. I mean, even last year, if the tide had turned after the summer break, Verstappen romping away, Ferrari's turned down, at least we had a bit of cost cap drama, silly season, Fernando Alonso keeping us on our toes, but we've not really had that. So, apart from the De Vries, Lawson, Ricciardo switcher, it's been quite quiet. So Alex, I know you like hypothesizing about the sort of driver moves and whatnot. So what can you tell us about, probably if not even this season, 2025 also?
Oh, one of my favourite pastimes, as you know now. But yeah, I mean, 2025 is the key, really, because in terms of the big name drivers, now we know Lewis Hamilton is secure at Mercedes for another couple of years, George Russell as well. There's simply going to be no changes for next year, and it's not like they're going to be. We think like Ferrari, both Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz have got contracts up for that season. They're not going to be making those decisions right now. If anything, they'll wait until the off season when things might step up more into gear. We know there's sort of been preliminary discussions, particularly Charles Leclerc and Fred Vasseur at Ferrari. So it's more things will get more formalized, and almost I would expect it to be more like 2020. Remember during the lockdown, when obviously there was no racing happening, and there was that flurry of movement in the driver market with Sebastian Vettel getting the boot at Ferrari and all the knock-on effects that had. I would expect it to be more like that in terms of looking for 2025, that it would be the sort of spring, early summer next year when the dominoes really start to fall and a lot happens. And we'll have even more to talk and hypothesize about come this time next year. But that said, there are still potential changes for 2024, and that primarily goes to the back of the grid. I think, I think it's sort of the noise is coming out of Alfa Romeo and the Zhou Guanyu camp is more that, they're pretty close to an extension, but at the same time, there's rumours that potentially there could be a shot sort of switch between Joe at Alfa Romeo and potentially him going to Williams, things like that, because there's another player in the market in Felipe Drugovich, the 2022 Formula 2 champion. Now, he's got a lot of backing from a Brazilian sponsor who is currently with Aston Martin, but the suggestion is that he's sort of been turning down opportunities in other championships. I'm thinking particularly Formula E, and he may well still end up there. These things could just not shake out as we're sort of hearing suggestions that they might do, but he's certainly a factor and definitely is a candidate for either Alfa Romeo or Williams. And that leaves, it's the sort of the musical chairs effect. Who's on, who's out? Well, unfortunately, you got to say it would be Logan Sargeant. Williams aren't getting rid of Alex Albon, of course not. He scored as many points in one season as the highest number of points in 2017 for any Williams driver in one campaign. So he's cemented there. He's doing absolutely excellently, thriving, I would say, outside the sort of Red Bull top team environment, and maybe making the case that a bit like Sergio Perez did in his career, maybe he'll get back to a leading team at some point in Albon. But anyway, Logan Sargeant is the one most at risk because he's just not living up to the side that Williams needs. And you spoke about them very eloquently earlier, Matt. My fear is that they've said long ago that there's no development happening on this 2023 car. It's all about next year. Well, that's not the same for other teams. I mean, I know Aston Martin aren't fighting Williams, but they're bringing more updates for Singapore. I'm led to believe Haas are going to have something pretty fundamental in the next couple of races as well, and that's really Williams' big foe come the end of the season when you look at how narrow the points gap is down the back of the grid. So it's a struggle for Sargeant, and that creates opportunity. So does Drugovich slot in there? Well, Mick Schumacher's their reserve driver. You'd say he's sort of a step up on Sargeant, but he performed so poorly at Haas, really, when the chips were down in 2022. And there's also a suggestion that maybe Mick's just missed his chance. Maybe he doesn't have the momentum and the sort of the thrust to get him back into Williams. We know James Vowles is one of his old jobs at Mercedes was assessing young drivers. So he's going to be the one ultimately making the call. And yet, Drugovich's money, Joe also has backing, and Joe's not been performing particularly badly. So could we see a switch between, drivers at the back of the grid, or the status quo ends up the same? Joe stays put. I think Alfa Romeo would be very happy with that. He's been pretty much at Valtteri Bottas's level. We don't know how high that ceiling is for Bottas since he's left Mercedes, other than, of course, for Joe, those big accidents that he's had, I think, at Zandvoort and, of course, in Hungary. So, yeah, potential moves come the back of the grid. That's where all the noise is at the moment. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but that would be the most likely switch that I could see. So, Matt, I mean, we briefly touched on your journey getting to Singapore via Helsinki, of course, the most natural place to change planes in the world. But what are you looking forward to when it comes to heading trackside at what's by this stage in its life a pretty iconic F1 venue? Yeah,
quite how delirious I'll be by the time I get there. It sounds like I'm complaining about going to Singapore. I'm absolutely not. It'd just be a long journey, and although this camera angle doesn't show, I'm quite tall, viewers, so legroom does come at a premium on these flights. But anyway, when I'm there, I think part of the driver market for next year, actually, to touch on quickly, is AlphaTauri. So it's basically 3-2 at the minute. Doesn't go. You've got Ricciardo through his injury, Lawson, and whether they keep hold of Yuki Tsunoda, who, Nick de Vries had his own motivations for nominating him, but it was him and a couple of others saying he was the star driver in the early part of the season. So what they do there, so in terms of going trackside, it's how Lawson performs, another sort of difficult track to make his adaptation to, but can he really stake a claim to having that seat full time? Because that's a choice. I think, marketability, his first two races of his comeback, Sergio Perez's future, Ricciardo is an absolute contender to keep hold of one of those seats. So it's who's up alongside him. Can Lawson, who's doing extremely well in Japanese Super Formula, an extremely competitive series, if he can translate that into a bit of F1 form as well, is that better than keeping hold of Tsunoda? So A, how he performs, and B, actually Sargeant, I don't say this to be like flippant or to get a cheap laugh, but because he is under pressure, the reality is the deadline's probably passed for him to put in a string of mega performances to absolutely convince Doralton and Williams to keep hold of him. It's probably past that point. It's too late now. But he still needs to show some signs of progress. And the flip side to that, incredibly unforgiving track. He's under pressure. Are you standing in a nice place in FP1 where he has quite a big spill and you see a bit of drama like that? It's a lot riding on it for his sake, and it's a track where there's not going to be an awful lot of margin for error. So yeah, I think a couple of those things. It's just sort of with street tracks. Obviously, it's an absolute luxury. You can get so close because they're concrete barriers. They're less well defined with runoffs and red zone areas for us to get to. So you can get close to the action. But also, they are brutal. There is no sneeze factor. So if you are, driving with 5% of your brain space, thinking about what your long-term plans are, or even as soon as next year, if that sort of wreaks havoc and he's coming back after a couple of crashes in Zandvoort and falling behind Albon again at Monza, maybe he either hooks it up and stars or gets it wrong. And if so, I sort of want to be there to see either.
Well, I'll add to my list of tips that I gave you earlier from my experience going to Singapore last year. I urge you, for when you are going trackside, head right down the far end of the paddock away from the media centre. Eventually, you'll work your way to turn 1. You'll pass some very hospitable and welcoming marshals standing at their posts, but you are going to go through a lot of undergrowth. It's pretty jungly down there underneath the sort of flyover. Look out for those massive lizard things. Remember the one that came on the track in front of Max Verstappen last year? That was my big fear, that one was going to emerge from the undergrowth behind me. So, and if you can, walk through any shopping centres, because that's where the air conditioning is, because otherwise you are just gonna melt.
I was going to say, that sounds an awful lot like life at home at the minute. I filled up the green bin, so I'm used to going through undergrowth recently. Because of the heat, all the spiders come inside, so I'm used to dealing with sort of imposters, and it's really hot here anyway. So Singapore will be home from home, slightly darker.
Okay, well, thanks for joining me, Matt. Enjoy your trip out there. I do hope the journey trackside, the journey to Singapore goes very well. And thank you, everybody, for watching along. Let us know what you're hoping to see this weekend in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe to stay tuned as we report on the Singapore Grand Prix this weekend and all the races to come in Formula One beyond.